Hello and welcome to the Future Water podcast in conjunction with Horizon Water Infrastructure, our transformation partner. I'm Paul Horton, CEO of Future Water, and in this episode, we're diving into the big challenges facing the UK water sector, such as climate change, infrastructure, and the need for real transformation. What does transformation actually mean, and how do we make space for innovation? I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Riley, Tanya Dadi from Horizon Water Infrastructure, and we're going to talk around transformation. The UK faces significant environmental challenges, including water scarcity, climate change impacts, increasing demand, new housing, new building, more challenging environmental situations. And one thing we do know is that we need to engage with the public in a different way, and we need to manage the issues we're facing in a different way, particularly when we're talking about water resources. And that will be the core theme of today's podcast. So one of the areas we want to explore is how can we change the way we behave? What does the sector look like? And in a context of transformation, what does that mean? What does transformation mean? I'm Paul Horton, I'm CEO at Future Water Association, and from our viewpoint, we set up several groups looking at areas like standards, leakage, metering, reputation of the sector, all things networks, pipes and sewers, and we're using those core groups to help define some key outputs, some key things that need to happen in the sector that will equal transformation as we see it. Underlining that is the need to have the honest conversation. So, Dan, Tanya, my first question to you both is, what does transformation look like from your viewpoint?
Transformation's an interesting word, isn't it? It gets bandied around quite a lot. And I always just start with what is the definition of transformation and how is it different to change? Transformation, to me, is about taking a way of working as an organisation or an individual or a sector and doing things radically differently to have a significant impact on the outcome that you're trying to achieve. It can be small things, can be transformational. I always use sporting analogies because I like a sporting analogy. Back in the Olympics, Chris Boardman had this amazing bicycle that transformed how cycling was approached, and that was transformational as an individual. Teams transform, and just in terms of their working practices and how they do that. And there's cultural transformation, which is about how you look at the issue and how you address it. I think change is slightly different. I think they're tweaks that can have minimal but marginal improvements on performance. So transformation to me is about a root and branch review of how we do things. Are we answering the right question, and how we approach trying to drive that through to have significant improvements on whatever outcome that you're shooting for. And it's interesting, isn't it? I'm not a water boy. I've worked in utilities for 20 to 30 years. And I don't think transformation needs to be new. I think a lot of people talk about transformation. It's got to be this new, marvellous invention. And sometimes it's just looking outside of the silos that we work in to see what we can bring in from other industries and practices to help us, get to where we're trying to get to.
And sometimes it can be about getting the basics right.
Yeah.
Tanya?
I think there are I always go back to these three core pillars, but it's all about people, processes and technology. In that sense, there are areas that you can influence in each of those three streams that really drive change, but you really need to invest in your people. You need to understand how this transformation in your business or within your culture is going to change processes and the way that people work. And then the technology piece, we're always looking for innovation, we're always looking for continuous improvement and new ways to do things, but sometimes the technology is just there and we're not using it properly. It's how we embrace that technology, how we get insights from that technology, and ultimately the transformation piece comes when we're delivering the outcomes, the goals that we're achieving.
Yeah, I think there's a bit around time, isn't there? If we look at everybody we engage with and with our own organisations, everybody's generally flat out. I always talk about being in top gear and in red in the rev counter, and it's really hard to step back from what you've always done to see how you could potentially do it better, whether that's looking outside of what you do, looking at different working practices or philosophies on approaches. And the key thing to me to drive transformation is about creating time. Because if you don't create time to think and explore and innovate, then nothing will ever change. And organisationally, I guess, is how do you invest? How do you justify investing time to explore what these areas are? We're generally charging from deadline to deadline to deadline. And I guess it's how do you create, or how does one create a belief set in an organisation that you should free up 20% of the workforce's time or colleagues' time to explore what the new world looks like, and then drive towards it. And I think that's a massive shift that needs to happen in all organisations. But it's how do you persuade your executive, your CFO or your CEO that time resource investment pays back into the future.
And in the water sector, we're particularly guilty of that. You know, my background's almost 20 years working with water companies, and you're always firefighting. There's always an operational need. There's always a drive from the regulator, a drive from the customer. Something's going on that is your urgent priority, and it is really hard to prioritise anything that's outside of the normal BAU.
Yeah.
So picking up on what you've both just said, what is the justification? Then you've mentioned, Dan, about how you need to think of this differently. You have to think the longer term, find space for innovation, find more space for doing things in that different way. What's the justification for doing that?
That's interesting, isn't it? So I guess when we're going to the board or trying to persuade colleagues or customers or partners to do something differently, there's generally a business case which has a defined outcome. So if we invest X amount of time and X amount of money, our return on investment will be Y, and therefore we should do that. And I guess that's a challenge with transformation and creating time, because that's more of a belief set. You believe that if you create space and time, then people will come up with innovative, new or unadopted ways of working, or technologies or processes, as to use Tanya's language, which will lead to a business benefit that's hard to quantify. And I think it's Google, isn't it? So Google's a good example. They have Fridays or a day a week where people can have side-of-desk projects. There's no business case in terms of you can only do side-of-desk projects on a Friday. You've got to generate £10 million return for Google. And some great things have come out of that. I think some not so great things, such as I think it was the Google glasses or something, wasn't it, that were invented. But out of that investment of time, huge changes have happened for that organisation, and products and propositions have come out. So I guess it's how do you create a framework where people can make decisions and drive forward without a cast iron business case and business justification. And to me, it's a belief set.
And is that responsibility, if we look at it in our sector, in the water sector, is that responsibility with the utilities, with the suppliers, with the regulators?
I think it sits with everyone. A lot of the behaviours that we see in the water sector are driven by regulation. So I think the regulator that plays a role in that, and customers' bills. We have to deliver good value for customers, and that's always the primary goal for any water company. A lot of it filters down through regulation. I think you've got board members and exec who drive their agendas, and ultimately water companies perform as businesses, but we're there to deliver clean, safe water and services to customers at the end of the day. And then there's a customer engagement piece in this as well. Customers want to see change. Customers are calling for innovation and change in the sector, and for everything to be cleaned up, and for us to have new water supplies. And all of that comes from allowing people to think and have the space to innovate, collaborate, engage with the supply chain and see what's out there so that we can transform the sector.
So I think the question was, who is responsible for creating time to drive innovation? And it's interesting because I guess you can look at it from how do we create it, or what's constraining it. I start with what the constraints, and if you can take those off, it then creates, I guess, the open space to drive it forward. So I think that the constraints that I see as new to the water sector, but obviously not to utilities or to business, is around we work in the world where there are budgets that are set on a 5-yearly basis, where you have to justify the investment or spend and how you're running your business and how that pulls through to customer bills. And I guess that creates a constraint, doesn't it? Because within there, how do you say, on X amount of money, which I can't justify an outcome on a customer bill that will allow at some point in the future for me to drive benefit. So I guess there's a question around, is the current way that budgets and prices are set constraining the ability to create that time, even if it's the want of a business? So there's that. Then I guess you could group water companies or water sector organisations into how are they looking at it as a unit to drive transformational change. So are there sector initiatives that can be put in place that will create that free air and that free space for thinking that don't require business justification? So a lot of the innovation that I see going on in innovation funds, there's still a business justification that sits behind those. So it's not free thinking. You've got to come up with the idea, work out the return, and then put it forward. So I think there's a piece around how could that change to be improved to give that clean air, and then obviously the final piece on that puzzle is around an individual water company, because it's a cultural belief, isn't it? How does an organisation create a culture where everybody is invited and motivated to want to come up with different ways of doing things that help the customer at the end of the day? And I think, it's setting the culture and then the processes and systems you have to drive those forward. There are constraints there, but ultimately only takes one person to have an amazing idea, and it's the ear that idea is presented to has to be welcoming, switched on, and wanted to take it forward. So there's no easy answer.
So we just touched on a couple of things there that I want to focus on before we get into the nitty-gritty of utilities and regulation, and it's customer. An element of all of this is not just the customer, but how that customer is communicated with, what that level of engagement is like. What do we do at the moment? Do we really understand in the sector what drives the customer behaviour, customer thinking? Does a customer really engage with the wider sector at the utility level or even beyond?
I think there's a lot of media scrutiny around the water sector at the moment, and unfortunately that's probably what most customers are seeing. From a water company point of view, you only really have very, very limited opportunities to engage with your customers. You send bills out once or twice a year, so there are 2 letters, emails, text notifications that go out to customers once or twice a year, and that really is the level of engagement that the customers receive from their water companies. The things that are coming in the next AMP cycle, with smart metering, I think there's a massive opportunity to engage customers, but there's also a reluctance in the sector to engage with customers because of CMEX, the customer measure of expectation and performance around that. So I think people are nervous about engaging with their customers. I think there's a reluctance to do it, and I think if we stand back and do nothing, it doesn't create an opportunity for something to go wrong and a customer to come in and complain and impact CMEX. So I think there's a fear culture around the water sector about engaging with customers, and there's potential for a massive missed opportunity there.
And yet within this mix, there's not just customer measure expectation or CMEX, as you mentioned. There's the next period, the next investment period. Companies need to look at consumption patterns and what the consumption patterns mean in terms of understanding that across the customer base. There then needs to be, doesn't there, not just a drive in terms of measurement, but a drive in terms of that understanding.
I always start with, whenever he talks about customer engagement, in terms of actually what are you trying to achieve? Because there are lots of different ways of engaging customers, but ultimately, what outcome are you trying to achieve as an organisation through engaging your customers? And I was always drilled into me when I was I think we were talking about earlier before we started about working in hotels, and we were all trained in the hotel group I worked for in Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and one of those was start with the end in mind. So we're starting with the end in mind in terms of customer engagement. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And I think that's the start of the debate. And it could be that we want to engage customers, so when the CMEX process takes place, they something really positive about us when there's a survey, so we get a great score. That could be an outcome. It could be that to deliver our leakage and per capita consumption reduction targets over the next X years, we have to get customers to understand the challenge that our country is faced with, whether that's, well, ultimately the main challenge I see it as is water shortage, and the part that they have to play in that to make sure that, our kids in 20 years when the taps are turned on don't run dry, that our communities aren't stood at stopcocks or by tankers filling up jugs of water, and the rivers that we all used to play in as kids still have water in them. And I think that's the debate, and I don't think it's for me to answer, but I would start with that. If it was from a personal perspective, obviously driven to make sure that there's water for my family, for my communities, and for the area that I live in and the country that I live in. And I think that should be, from my perspective, the end goal. And then it's how do you take customers on that journey? And I think to Tanya's point around that tsunami of negative press that's hitting them about a completely different topic, and that's not to diminish the importance of that topic, but how do you get cut through? And I think I said earlier on that I'm new in terms of learning detail about the water sector. Part of my research, you found out that London, I think, was 9th on the global cities risk of running out of water over the next 10 years. And you think surely that would get cut through, that somebody would know that. But you ask 100 people on the street, I'd be amazed if one person knew that, which to me sounds pretty significant. I think Cape Town over the last 5 years, and London could be in a very similar position. So therefore, I think a bit goes back to the constraints on transformation. It's from a regulatory perspective, what organisationally is the government or the regulator doing to drive that awareness within the general population, because they're aware, obviously, of the challenge, because that's where the targets come from. There's a bit from, I guess, a group of companies as water companies. How do we create a narrative to the population and our communities around the challenges that we're faced with? And then there's an engagement strategy and a communication strategy that the water companies can do individually as part of various interactions they have with people. So
and it's not just the water companies, is it? Then if we're looking at this in terms of water usage, we've got the retail world, the retail water market world with all the commercial developments. We've got obviously agriculture and all the other issues that go with that, as well as all the households and new buildings. So what's critical in this space? I'm trying to get to that. What's the important thing that we're not doing at the moment?
I think it's a customer education piece. Water scarcity is happening right now. We're seeing population growth, particularly in the southeast of the country. We're seeing climate change. There's high levels of leakage. Ultimately, we're being restricted on the amount of water that we can abstract from the natural environment. So we know that there's new infrastructure needed. We need to build new reservoirs, we need to build new pipelines and have resilience in our existing networks. But ultimately, we need to reduce the amount of water that we're using per person, per household, and really drive that down. We can be far more efficient, but there's a massive education piece, because water's cheap. Water's a human right. Everyone thinks that they deserve the right to use as much water as they like, and it's damaging our environment ultimately. And
do we understand that volume of usage? Do we know what actually goes into supply and then what's used versus leakage? Do we know how much water available there is across surface water, groundwater?
Yes, I mean that there's water resource management planning that happens at a water company level, a regional level, and even at a national level. So there's an understanding of it, but the measurement piece is really interesting, because ultimately, if you can't measure it, you can't change it. And I think understanding the individual components that go into this overall water balance, there are still so many assumptions. We make assumptions about household usage for unmetered customers. We make assumptions about non-household usage, night use allowances, minimum night flows. Everything's built on assumptions, and ultimately we need more measurement, more accurate measurement, and more granularity of data to really inform our decisions around that space. And
does that equal metering? Should we meter every organisation, every household that uses water?
In my view, absolutely, yeah. I think universal metering is coming. Obviously, for some water companies, compulsory metering or universal metering is already permitted. So they have quite high meter penetration. Other areas of the country that are less water stressed don't have that drive to install meters. And again, it comes back to that customer piece. Sometimes you upset customers by giving them a meter. Some customers want a meter, they want a way to reduce their bills and be more efficient with their water usage. But others don't want to be measured and have never been measured. And there's a difficult conversation coming there because, in my opinion, everybody needs to be measured. And then we can start to use the insights that come from that data to really inform the decisions that we make, the investments that we make over not just the next 5 years, the next AMP period. We should be looking at a far longer time horizon so we can make good investment choices and ultimately deliver the best value for those customers.
So like the water resource management plans, a 25-year period. So what is the level of meter penetration across the country?
It varies by water company. So again, in the south, we see quite high levels where we've had universal metering programs, kind of high 70s, 80s. But some water companies are still in the 30%. So they have the vast majority of their customer base are not metered at the moment. So their journey towards universal metering and ultimately universal smart metering as the next step on that journey, I think is a longer one with far more customer engagement because they're in a different starting position. Everyone's in a different starting position across the country.
Okay, so if we assume then that we want universal metering, and everyone's at a different place for different reasons, and you just mentioned there about smart metering, are we saying that it should be smart metering? What are the benefits of smart metering versus what I'm guessing from what you said, some meters are mechanical?
It's about the data. So it's about the quality of the data. The frequency of the data is the key thing from a smart meter. And it's interesting, isn't it? We spent a lot of time rolling out smart meters in the energy sector. So for those that don't know, we've got over 3.5 million energy meters rolled out across the UK, and I've had lots of, I guess, experience and learnings and expertise in doing that. But ultimately, there are different layers to a smart rollout and why it should be smart rather than traditional. I think clearly getting quality data consistently over a 15 or 20 year program is critical. But clearly, data without a plan on what to do with it, it's just data sat on a system somewhere. So it's critical around what are we going to do with that data and how is it going to help us achieve our outcomes. And it links back into the point we were talking about before, doesn't it, around customer engagement, what are we trying to achieve and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve from that and how that all supports itself together. Clearly smart metering is critical. The piece to me is how do you get it right? And again, that links to the customer, doesn't it? It's about customer trust. So putting a smart meter program together is incredibly complex. There are lots of moving parts and there's huge amounts that can go wrong, which we've learned as an organisation, having done this for 16 years. So it's so important to ensure that the program is planned effectively. I won't bore you with the details of contracts. To ensure you get it working, because you can make a lot of noise about smart metering, make a lot of noise in the marketplace out as to why it's important and why it's important for a customer to accept it and what you expect and need of them to do with that data and what accountability they need to take. But if you get it wrong, which many organisations have, and it's not a risk that never happens. Lots of people on smart meter programs and they've not worked effectively. You break your trust with the customer. They don't trust you as an organisation to roll out anything effectively. So super important for smart meters to achieve the outcomes from leakage and consumption reduction.
And can I ask then, what's meant by smart metering?
That's ask 100 people, you probably get a different definition from each. But for me, ultimately, it's a meter that reads the consumption of some sort of utility, whether it's energy, gas or water, and sends that data back to a central repository on a very regular basis, which can be predetermined. But the most important thing is consistently over the length of your program. It's quite easy is wrong. It's easier to get a smart meter program rolled out and communicating effectively and data being sent consistently. But it's much harder to get that working effectively for 15 years. So it's how you build that into the planning process. But ultimately, it's getting data on consumption and usage back to a central repository over a level of frequency that's predetermined.
And that's determined for the water sector ultimately by the regulation that Ofwat set. So there were some PCDs set around completeness and connectivity in terms of what defines what smart is. They have been adjusted since the final determinations in December, but for data completeness, there's 85% of hourly reads should be registered within a given week. And then in terms of connectivity, there should be data at least once a week for 80% of the year. And that would be the Ofwat definition of a smart meter.
Ofwat's the economic regulator, and PCD is?
So a price control deliverable, so that determines the amount of income that a water company can generate through this scheme. So each water company would have put in a business case in their PR24 submissions to the regulator on the assumption that you meet these performance commitments to the regulator, to the customer. You're allowed to charge the intended level on customer bills.
I've got a question. There are targets on the reducing leakage by 50% by 2050 and PCC by 20% by 2050. Do you think if you create a smart system and plan that delivers those minimum targets set by Ofwat, that those targets by 2050 can be achieved?
Well, the 2050 targets are based around a presumption that we need to reduce the amount of megalitres of water per day used across everything, so industry, agriculture, as well as population. Three critical components of that. One is obviously more water resources, reservoirs. Another critical component is reducing the level of leakage. And from my perspective, you can only do that, and you can only agree to that 50% if you actually know what it is you're reducing it from. And this is where I think, I sit on the universal metering side, because then we know the amount of water that's being used, and not just at the domestic level but across industry as well, which is why the retail market's very important.
And in terms of leakage reduction, there's a really clearly defined adaptive pathway in terms of how we meet that 50 by 50 target. So it's about establishing solid DMAs, district metered areas, that you can measure and understand what's going on